I'll hand it off to you, sir.
All right, I'm in the process of sharing my screen, and I have the subtitles turned on. So hopefully this won't blow things up. Last time I presented, the subtitles ruined things for bandwidth and stuff like that, I guess.
It looks fine. It looks
Okay,
fine.
very good. So what is Arc and Arc enabled data services is what we're going to talk about today. And as Tim said, my name is Rick Heiges, and I'm a senior cloud solution architect in the data and AI space in the U.S. manufacturing vertical here at Microsoft. Prior to joining Microsoft, by the way, I've been with Microsoft now for 3.5 years. And basically, before joining Microsoft, I was an MVP for many years. I've been very involved with the SQL Server community, data community for many years. Went to PASS all the time, and I still speak at SQL Saturday events occasionally. Of course, a lot of the stuff is virtual now, but hopefully we'll get back to being in person, and we can, look each other in the eye and go that way. So. But first of all, let's talk about how did I get interested in Arc and Arc data services? Well, basically, I was working with a customer last year, and they're a manufacturing customer because I'm in the manufacturing vertical, and they have plants from all around the country where they're doing work, and they said, "Hey, we have SQL servers at this plant, but we don't have a DBA. Yeah, we have some remote, DBA, work on stuff, but we don't, we want to keep it updated and stuff like that." And I go, "Great, move it to Azure because, we can put it on a managed instance. We'll do, have built-in high availability for you. We'll do the backups for you. We'll patch it automatically for you." And they said, "That's great, but if the internet goes down, we don't have access to that, which means then our plant will be down." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, that could be a problem." So I started looking into Arc and Arc data services. And it's been around for about 2.5 years now. So it's like, let me take a look at this. And actually, Azure Arc data services, the SQL managed instance piece that we're going to be going a little bit deeper into here, it went GA last summer for the general purpose tier, and then the business critical tier just went GA, I think, just about a month or so ago. So we'll talk more about that stuff really soon. But anyway, so I said, so this is how I got interested in Arc. And so what is Arc? Well, it's not a TLA or a 3-letter acronym. It is actually the name of a product offering and service, if you will, from Microsoft. And basically this allows you to extend that Azure control plane to assets outside of Azure. So that means that we can enable a Windows server, a Linux server, Kubernetes cluster, stuff like that, in order to extend the control plane so you can see what's outside of Azure, out of the purview of Azure, if you will. And this really enables that single pane of glass view of assets. So I think if you have a particular workflow or project that's kind of partially in Azure and partially on-prem, you could put them all in the same subscription resource group. You can tag them so you can organize and inventory stuff, and actually even increase some governance and security with that as well, and see that all that stuff from a single pane of glass. So that's kind of cool. And it really brings that that hybrid scenario into reality, because you can even do some role-based operations on the stuff in here, and you can manage it via the portal, the command line interface, or with PowerShell, etc. So there's different ways you can actually interface with it. One thing that we need to make sure that is understood here is that although it is, when we're talking about data services, it's a PaaS offering in a way, but there are no Microsoft SLAs. And that's because we don't control the infrastructure. We don't control the compute, the storage, the networking. that stuff is all customer managed. So when we're talking about SLAs, usually we think about uptime and stuff like that with PaaS services, but in this case, it is that is on the customer because they control the infrastructure piece. So that is kind of a point of importance that you need to understand because you still have to have the right people, the right processes in order to make everything work and the right technology. So that's kind of important. So basically, what do I get by going down this ARC road, if you will? Well, there's some no-cost benefits. Basically, we have this ARC agent you can install on Windows or Linux servers, and basically it helps basically organize and inventory your resources through Azure Management Groups and Tags. Azure Resource Group Graph basically can help you search and index through all that stuff. Access and security through Azure RBAC and subscriptions. And environments and automation can be done through templates and extensions. So there's lots of kind of neat things going on there. And also update management. So for example, we'll have a screenshot of this here in just a minute, but you can basically update your SQL Server through the Azure portal, through the little ARC blade, if you will, on that particular ARC-enabled SQL Server, so you can keep your Windows and SQL Server up to date. Now, so that stuff is free, if you will. Okay, that's part of the no-cost benefits of ARC. And also, what this enables you to do is extend some of the Azure services, like Azure Defender and on-demand SQL health checks. You can actually extend those services to reach into your ARC-enabled SQL Server and help protect it and help check on the health status. And of course, those are value-added features which have their separate pricing, et cetera, that you would have to pay for. So another thing I want to point out is that the minimum version to do Azure Arc on is SQL Server 2012. Well, SQL Server 2012 is going out of extended support in just a couple weeks here. I think it's July 12th. So that means there will be no more security updates for SQL Server 2012 unless you move it into Azure, or you can get discounted what we call extended security updates. Get discounted extended security updates if you ARC enable your SQL Server 2012s that are outside of Azure. So that's a good thing to know in case you can't move your workload into Azure for your SQL Server 2012 workload into Azure. You can ARC enable it and get discounts, and contact your Microsoft rep for more information, or you can contact me and I can help try and point you in the right direction on what to do there. So in an earlier slide, I mentioned Kubernetes. And if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, you say, what is Kubernetes? I've heard of it maybe, but I don't know exactly what it is. And actually, you might actually see it abbreviated as K8S. And why do they abbreviate this way? Because it's the letter K followed by 8 letters with the letter S at the end. So that's how they came up with the abbreviation K8S. So when you see K8S, that's Kubernetes. And that's an open source orchestration tool for containers. And it makes managing those containers much easier across multiple environments. And it really started to shine when microservices really started to take off, and we had all these little servers running around. And really started us to really think about servers more as herd and less as pets, because if you've been working with SQL Server for a long time, you probably remember all the servers you've worked with, maybe the care and feeding of the servers, and make them feel just right, if you will, because you knew the characteristics of them and stuff like that. When you have hundreds or even thousands of servers that you need to manage, you can't be concerned with the care and feeding of each little server, if you will. So you need to think of things in terms of a herd. And sometimes when a member of the herd gets sick, you have to do something about it, and it might be put out of its misery and get a new one. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about with Kubernetes. So it helps with high availability, scalability, performance, business continuity type stuff. So it's really cool technology, and we're going to be talking more about that when we talk about high availability with the Arc-enabled data services. In each Kubernetes has it's makes up of a cluster. It has a master and worker nodes that have pods, and they are surrounded, if you will, interconnected with its own virtual network. And so that makes detection and healing and basically manipulation much easier to do when you're in that. So I said I'm a SQL Server guy, and I love to run SQL Server. And when I think about running SQL Server in Azure, I said, okay, I can run SQL on a Azure VM, IaaS, right? It's very similar to how you run SQL Server on-prem, but it's on an Azure VM. Okay, that's great. I also think of the PaaS services that Microsoft has for running SQL, and that is, of course, Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is very similar to IaaS. It's almost scary similar nowadays. It's they keep knocking out some of the differences month after month. It seems there's something new that they've eliminated the blocker from. And then there's also Azure SQL Database, which has been around for many, many years. And you might remember the discussion about what is a DTU, a database transaction unit, and how does that work with Azure SQL Database, and what does that mean in terms of vCores and stuff like that. So when I think about running SQL Server in Azure, those three things come to my mind. When I think about running it on-prem, I'm thinking about I'm going to run SQL Server 2000 whatever, 2019, let's say, or pretty soon, 2022, right? But I'm going to be running, SQL Server, some version of it, on premises, maybe on a VM, maybe on a physical box, and so I can now Arc enable that, so I can actually see it from Azure. And this is the thing that I had a hard time getting my head around, and that was I'm now able to run an Arc-enabled SQL managed instance. I have to say the whole thing. However, I don't work for the product group, so I can shorten that, and they won't yell at me. So Azure Arc-enabled SQL managed instance, I can run that on-prem as well within a Kubernetes type cluster. And there's also, I'm just going to mention it now real quick, and that is there's also an Azure Arc-enabled Postgres SQL offering as well that runs in a managed style within the Kubernetes cluster as well. And actually, there's some changes coming out to that, and they do have something in preview right now, but I understand there's going to be some changes to it. So we're kind of going to put that off to the side. We probably won't talk about it again too much here today. So we're going to focus, first of all, on Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server. And what does that look like? So essentially, above the dotted line is stuff that we have in Azure, right? Stuff below the dotted line is what we have on-prem. Now, I'm going to say this once because it's just easier for me to think of stuff about on-prem. But actually, this SQL Server that I'm showing here, it can run in AWS. If I have a SQL Server running in AWS or GCP or some other hosted environment, if I can install an Arc agent onto that operating system, and I can see it from Azure. So I'm going to say on-prem because from a discussion point of view, just makes it clearer. From on-prem, of course, I control my infrastructure, my underlying compute, my underlying storage, networking, all that stuff. But I have my operating system and my SQL Server running, so I can install an Arc agent with the SQL Arc extension on it, and also install the monitoring agent, so I can do more things with it, like enable Azure Defender, do the SQL on-demand health checks, things of that nature. So it's not very complicated, and there's no downtime to enabling it. So I don't have to do any type of data migration. I don't have to restart the SQL Server or reboot the box. It's a quick and easy install, wire it up to Azure, and you're good to go. And so, some of the key benefits, again, I think one of the big benefits, especially with the type of customers I work with that are, large enterprises, is that they can, better manage their global inventory of SQLs wherever it is and whatever type it is. It can manage that, and I can make it more secure, and I can get better health benefits by running on-demand SQL health checks. And as a matter of fact, when I think about, hey, I have SQL Server on-prem, and my organization is moving to Azure. I don't know if I want to learn some stuff first. This is a great way to put your toe in the water, if you will, and understand how to operate stuff within Azure, but also whenever we take a look at the screenshot of what you get from this on-demand SQL health check, you get to kind of understand, do I have any security vulnerabilities that I need to think about? Performance concerns, business continuity type stuff. So those are the three main areas that it looks at from an on-demand SQL health check. And so you can improve upon those, especially if you have some performance issues. When you do move that workload from on-prem into Azure, you can better right-size it. In other words, maybe if you have a big VM today and you have it sized that way to handle peak loads, well, maybe we can get the performance to a point where we don't need as many cores when we move it into Azure. So that's another great benefit as well. So real quick, the requirements is SQL Server 2012 and up. Remember, discount ESUs for Arc enabling SQL Server 2012. And of course, you need, for SQL Server 2012, you need at least Windows Server 2012 R2. And if you're running SQL Server 2017 or later on Linux, these are the minimum versions that you would need for of those various Linux OSs in order to install the agents. The permissions of what you need to be able to have in order to install this is documented on that link there. And of course, I'll be sharing the slides with Tim. And the agents that you're going to be most interested in is the Azure, excuse me, Connected Machine agent with SQL Arc extension, the monitoring agent that used to be Log Analytics agent. So and that enables some of those value-added services. Excuse me. So here is a screenshot of the update management blade that you would have if you have an Arc-enabled SQL Server. And as you can see, it has the ones that are highlighted in red that are security updates. They show you how many are critical, how many are important, and stuff like that. So you can also schedule these updates to be had. Now, for a lot of enterprise customers, they already have a patch management software that they use for all of their machines, whether they be in Azure or on-prem or wherever, and that's great. But if you don't have that ability, don't have that third-party patching mechanism, you can go in here and schedule your update. So that's kind of cool. I mentioned about the SQL Health Assessment. It's a screenshot of what you would get from the result of that. And it tells you, first thing it shows you is, hey, how complete is this health check? In this case, it was 100% complete. It was able to run all of the tests it needed to run, all the checks, et cetera. So you know that, so what was reporting to you is good. Then we have security and compliance, and it also weights the different things that you need to look at. Availability and business continuity items, and then off to the side, I didn't get a picture of that, is performance. So those are the main areas that you see for the SQL Health Assessment results, if you will. So just to summarize about the Arc-enabled SQL Server piece here, and the main benefit I see from it is that besides discounted ESUs for SQL Server 2012, that's a pretty good benefit there, discounted ESUs. But basically, it allows you to inventory and organize stuff outside of Azure, so you can see it from within Azure, so you can group things together, organize, inventory it better. So that's probably what I think is the probably one of the biggest benefits there. The next thing that I like about this is, especially if you're an on-prem DBA type person, nothing is really going to change, at least not very much. Just small things, like I said, update management you can do, the SQL health checks you can do. So those are things that you can actually deal with. It's very small changes. There's no data migration. There's no downtime with it. You can enable those other services if you like, if you want to take advantage of those. But that is kind of what Arc-enabled SQL Server is in a nutshell. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions. Tim, are there any questions out there?
We have one that looks like he's typing a question, but George Carl looks like he's typing a question, but nothing formal yet. Oh, he just said you have a lot to learn, but he has a ton of questions, but he'll load them now. So stand by for that later, Rick. Okay,
sounds good. All right, so now we get to talk about the fun stuff. Okay, I mean, I like the Arc-enabled SQL Server stuff, and I think does some great new benefits with it as well. But this is where the cool stuff happens, I think, in what we call the Azure Arc-enabled data services. This is where we start to get into all the fun stuff. But here's the thing: it is very different. So if you're going to delve into this, you need to think about updating your skill set. The very first thing that you probably want to learn more about is Kubernetes. I mentioned Kubernetes earlier, and there's a ton of things you can, places you can go to learn about Kubernetes. As a matter of fact, Microsoft Learn has a set of learning modules that you can use to start off with, and I know there's lots of other great resources out there on the internet as well. Second thing I would say that you should learn about is GitHub, because there's lots of really cool stuff people put out there into GitHub that you can leverage and use within Kubernetes itself and other open source type of things out there. So if you're not familiar with GitHub and how to use it, again, there's some Learn modules on there, and again, other resources out there as well. And the tools that you'll want to learn more about are Azure Data Studio, which you may have already used. It's actually, I think, part of SQL Server Management Studio download whenever you install the latest tools of that. So it actually has some extensions in it that are specific for Arc-enabled data services. So that's kind of cool as well. dbeaver, which is it's a tool. They have a community edition, which is free. They have a professional edition that you have to pay for that can help you collaborate with more people, I think it is. But anyway, it's a great little tool, and it connects with just about any database that you can think of. So dbeaver is something good to kind of learn and just have another tool in your tool belt. And last but definitely not least, Lens. And so this is K8s Lens. Remember KAS, Kubernetes. This is K8s Lens .dev. And they have a free edition, and they also have a team edition, I believe it is. But basically, this helps you visualize a little bit more about what your Kubernetes clusters look like. So it helps you, especially if you're just trying to get your head around things, can help with that very much as well. So update your skills. If you're going to go into Arc-enabled data services, you have to update your skills. So what's the high-level architecture of this? And so we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner, and that's where we have our data Azure administrator type person, and they can basically interface with the data services through a couple things. They can go to Microsoft Azure and to the portal and the CLI to interface with it, or if they have like Azure Data Studio loaded onto their laptop, they can go through that and connect into the Kubernetes API to hit their Kubernetes cluster that's on-prem. The key thing here, whenever we're talking about Arc-enabled data services, is there's something called the Azure Arc Data Controller, and that is the conduit, if you will, between the other stuff, the data services like your Postgres or managed instances that are Arc-enabled running on top of your Kubernetes cluster, and to Azure. So basically, that is the conduit or the main glue that holds all the stuff together is the data controller. So, like I said, I'm a SQL guy. So let's first talk about managed instance. And this is something they'll also kind of like gone, wow, this is kind of cool. So I can create, remove, scale up, scale down a SQL managed instance within minutes, not hours. And if you ever run or spun up a SQL managed instance in Azure, the last time I spun one up, it took about 3 hours or so, which is much better than the 24 to 48 hours it was a few years ago when it first came out. But still, it's like 3 hours, and they are working to get that down. I think the goal is to get it under 15 minutes or something like that. And that's because there's lots of complexities within Azure that it has to deal with. Here, it's just dealing with the Kubernetes cluster, and they leverage Kubernetes in lots of different ways to simplify things. And that's why it's so easy to create a managed instance here within your Kubernetes cluster. Also, whenever you're running a SQL managed instance, you are basically using SQL. So we need to get that information about usage. How big was the managed instance? How long was it running for? Did we scale up? Did we scale down, et cetera? So we need to get that usage information to Azure so that so the billing can be done correctly. And also because it is just like, well, it is basically the same SQL bits that are running in Azure for managed instance and Azure SQL Database. The same bits there are basically being run here within an Arc-enabled SQL managed instance. So basically, that's is a cool, because you don't have to think about what version am I on, and that's another thing that's kind of just a tangent. For over the past especially 5 years, 10 years, but especially the past 5 years, been focused a lot on, instead of focusing what version you're running of SQL Server, it's like, what is your compatibility level? Because as you go up in compatibility level, you enable certain things like some basically query behavior, query processing behavior is affected by that. But when you're in a managed instance, you're an evergreen environment. In other words, it won't be deprecated. You're always going to be running up-to-date SQL within your environment. And so we have the ability to, of course, there's automated backup with it. There is built-in high availability, and it's being refreshed on a constant basis. So basically, when we think about SQL Managed Instance, it is saying, hey, I love what I do with SQL Server, and I like the managed aspects of it, but I can't go to Azure for whatever reason. I need to stay on-prem. And that is really what is built for. Okay, I just want to make sure I got all that because my first screen over here is kind of small. It's deployed on Kubernetes, which is basically a containerized application. It uses Kubernetes, such as constructs like stateful sets and persistent storage to basically manage all of this stuff. And it has failover detection and can spin up another instance of managed instance very quickly in order to approach HA. And we can take that basic HA that Kubernetes gives us, and we can actually enhance it with always-on availability groups. And if you've ever implemented always-on availability groups, there is a lot of plumbing that you need to do in the background in order to get things to work. And basically, with this, it does it for you. It says, "Oh, you need always-on availability groups for you. We're going to do all that plumbing for you in the construct of a Kubernetes cluster. We're going to do a little wiring back for you." And it's very similar, just like, if you will, always-on availability groups that you're used to seeing. So how does high availability happen within managed instance? And what I'm going to talk about here is for general purpose. Okay, so essentially what we have is we have our Kubernetes cluster, and we're provided with some remote persistent storage, and that is connected to a node that has the bits running of SQL Managed Instance. And so they're connected and everything's going great. And all of a sudden, let's say something happens and to that particular SQL Managed Instance, and Kubernetes discovers that, there's something going on here that isn't good. It says, I'm going to spin up another compute node for you and attach the storage to you. So basically what happens during that time is whenever it spins up that other compute and attaches to storage, just like it would if you, with regular SQL Server, if something like that would happen, if you were to come by and turn off your SQL Server, if you had SQL Server running on a physical box and you pulled the plug out and then plugged it back in, right, it would go through crash recovery. And that's what happens here for general purpose. And it's very similar to what happens in Azure for managed instance for general purpose high availability, because basically you have remote storage and you have compute, and if something bad happens to that node, it switches over to another node, which means that storage goes over there, and it goes through crash recovery in order to get back up running. So that takes a few minutes for that recovery to happen and for you to be back up and running, which is very acceptable for a lot of workloads out there. Okay, so that is general purpose high availability. Now for business critical, what we can do, and they've actually enhanced this a little bit since the last time I just listened to Jess Schultz the other day talking about this. But essentially, for business critical, we can have 2 or 3 replicas that you can decide which one's going to be best for you. But in this case here, in this picture here, I have 3 replicas. So of my primary, I have a readable secondary, and I have a third one that's there purely for failover. And so this is one thing to know about this is that you have one availability group in this business critical setting with all the databases in it, including your system databases, by the way. So that way, if I'm going to have a failover event, everything's going to fail over. And I do have a separate copy of the data. These are both synchronous AGs, basically, underneath the covers. They're going on. And so I can, if I have something bad happen, it's going to detect it, and it's going to switch the listener that's being provided by the Kubernetes cluster for the endpoint. It's going to move that listener over to, in this case, the failover node. The failover node will become new primary, and it will spin up a new, in this case, new failover, or the former primary, if you will. It will spin up a new compute for that and heal it that way. So, and the failover time here is on the order of seconds versus minutes. So if you need faster failover, if you need if you want to get that warm, fuzzy feeling that DBA is like of having multiple copies of your data, right, then business critical may be the best solution here. So I'm just going to pause there because I saw some chat messages pop up. I couldn't read them though. So Tim, do we have some questions?
Yeah, from George Carlisle. It's kind of broken into 4 sections. So the first one is, and again, it might tie back into previously presented content. So what platforms does Arc work with? And then he follows it with, I thought Arc was for all clouds, but this looks like Arc is for clouds that run Microsoft products. So what platforms does Arc work with?
Okay, good question. So Arc is a product offering or service, if you will. And so we can, there's a couple ways to look at this. You can install an Arc agent onto Windows or onto Linux. Okay, so you can Arc enable servers that way. Or we can also Arc enable Kubernetes. So if you have, and I think it's documented on the website about the certain requirements for Kubernetes, but basically we can run it on AWS. You can run on Google Cloud Kubernetes. So they've actually have, I'm going to point to some resources later called Arc Jumpstart, and they have some scripts there that you can actually, that give you, and they can say, here, go take this and run it over there. What the Arc does, if you will, is it kind of lights up those things that are outside of Azure, so you can see them. So it's not just within Azure. As a matter of fact, Arc is meant to not run in Azure, but to spread out, if you will, and to touch things, light things up outside of Azure, so you can have eyes on them from within Azure.
All righty. And then the second question is, can Arc work with other clouds' pricing thresholds? And then, for example, if costs get to be 1,000, move back to Azure UK data center. Like, does it have a price trigger or balancing thing?
I don't believe so, because basically, from just a point of view from what Arc can see is we probably wouldn't have access to that building information. So I wouldn't think that would be part of that.
Okay. Number 3, how is the orchestration done? Is this only PS or Python or Bicep, is this only PS or Bicep, or can I use Ansible or Terraform with this?
I have not gone down that road and automating stuff. I'm still learning a lot about all this stuff myself. From an implementation point of view, though, I would think that if you can write a Terraform script, and probably Bicep as well, I would think that we would be enabled that way as well.
Gotcha. Number 4, and this is the last one. Do you have a guide to work with the various clouds like Oracle and Huawei and AWS and Baidu and IBM? Each of these clouds have their own complexities. I imagine Microsoft's working on this in a roadmap, but he's curious as to maybe how far down the roadmap they've gotten.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Arc Jumpstart project, and I have a link to that later in the slide deck. And they have, I said, they have scripts, they have resources that basically walk you through how you can enable Arc data services on Kubernetes elsewhere. And I don't know if it covers all the clouds, but I know AWS and GCP are definitely there.
Okay. And those are the big questions.
Okay, cool. All right, so we're going to continue talking about SQL Managed Instance, Arc-enabled Managed Instance. Have to make sure I say that. But basically, talk about the tiers. And so for Azure Managed Instance, there is a general purpose tier and there is a business critical tier. And we have the same names here, but they kind of mean different things. And the way I like to think about it is if you are familiar with Enterprise Edition, and Standard Edition for SQL Server, the same concept is applied here for business critical and general purpose. So and the reason why I say this is because when you take a look at some of these limits, for example, the general purpose, which is like same as SQL Server Standard, basically, when you think about Standard and Enterprise Edition, Standard has almost everything that Enterprise does. There's just limits on things like the amount of memory that is being allocated for features such as column store, stuff like that. Same thing here, whereas basically if you have a general purpose SQL Managed Instance and you want to run standard or general purpose, then you are limited to 24 cores. You can't go above 24 cores there. You can also not allocate more than 128 gigabytes to that managed instance for an Arc-enabled general purpose managed instance. The failover, the high availability mechanism is provided by Kubernetes, so it isn't a separate, it's not enhanced like you get with business critical. So business critical, there are no limits on that as far as number of CPUs or memory, and availability groups are basically used to provide high availability for you. One other thing I want to point out, which is it can be a good thing or not. Depends on, there's pros and cons to everything. Whenever you're looking at an Azure Managed Instance, basically Microsoft has defined the offerings in terms of what hardware we're going to offer it on, how many cores we're going to offer it on, how much memory per core that we're allocating, things of that nature, right? So that's from Azure's point of view, from Azure SQL Managed Instance. When we're looking at Arc here, you control that. Remember, I said you're in charge of the infrastructure here, right? You're in charge of the storage, the compute, the networking. So if you want to have an Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance with let's say 28 cores and 124 gigabytes of RAM, you can do that. You can go into and basically configure whatever configuration makes sense for your workload. Or if you need a bigger compute and less memory, you can do that. I could have a 16 core managed instance, Arc-enabled managed instance with only 16 gigs of RAM. That'd be a very unique workload, I think, but you could do that. So and the other thing is, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? But it's one of those things where you have more flexibility to do this. And you can scale it up, you can scale it down very easily. Again, because it's basically Kubernetes is spinning up another compute and switching the the storage over to the new compute size, whatever it is. So you can scale up maybe during the day when you're busier and scale back down at night. So that's kind of a neat feature there. Connectivity modes. So I think I saw a comment fly by earlier talking about, air-gapped environment. What is an air-gapped environment? And this is where we're going to kind of address that. So there's two different what we call connectivity modes for Arc-enabled data services. We have indirectly connected, which means basically everything that we're going to do is going to go through that Azure Arc data controller. So it can go and grab data, billing information from the managed instances and bring that back into Azure, and it can be the conduit, if you will, to flow through there, so that those Azure Arc data services are not directly connected to the internet. The data controller would need to be, okay, but the other things do not. And if the internet goes down, you're still running, okay. So that the it is allows for that. That's those scenarios where, and actually connection mode is if the internet gets down, you're still up and running as well. The main difference between them is what you are basically allowing to interface with. Whenever you go with directly connected mode, basically a lot of the services, we're going to get to the next slide here in just a second, are enabled, like Azure Defender, the SQL, the Azure Defender stuff, the additional data services that you can implement with Azure are available when you're in, like Azure AD authentication would only be available in directly connected mode because it has to be able to talk to Azure in order to get to that. Now, the connections are always initiated from your environment into Azure. So that's one of the big security things, is make sure that you initiate the connection, not someone from outside the organization. It goes over standard ports and protocols such as HTTPS and port 443. And private endpoints are supported. I know that helps out with a lot of security stuff that we've seen over the past couple of years. And I'm actually just going to bypass this because it's about, I'm going to go to, and I saw that we're starting to run out of time here. Azure Backup, long-term retention, Azure AD, Azure role-based access, provisioning configuration. If you're not directly connected, you can't do stuff from the portal to it, obviously. And here is a side-by-side list, basically, of talking about, hey, what can I do with indirectly connected mode versus directly connected mode? And as you can see with the list of things that are on here, there are so much more is enabled when you're in directly connected mode. Azure AD authentication, Azure Backup, blob storage, Azure Monitor, Container Insights, Advanced Threat Protection, vulnerability. So a lot of this stuff is enabled with directly connected mode, but you can be indirectly connected mode as well. So if you think about like certain industries, government, healthcare may be more inclined to use indirectly connected mode than directly connected mode. So that's kind of cool. One other thing, I know we're starting to run out of time here, but I wanted to talk about this because this is brand new stuff that just was presented to actually earlier this week. And that is, in Azure, we have something called failover groups for managed instance. And so basically I can have, my managed instance in one region, and I have another managed instance that's being caught up all the time to it in a different region for DR purposes. And so we have the same type of construct going on here. And this particular representation is of a business critical implementation that is, say, on the left-hand side, uses actually distributed availability groups underneath the covers to have another copy in a different Kubernetes cluster. So we have one Kubernetes cluster feeding asynchronously to another Kubernetes cluster. So if something bad happens and I need to fail over for DR purposes, I can. So again, this is brand new stuff here, but basically, if you're familiar with distributed availability groups and the limitations thereof, then it's going to be very similar to that. Going to wrap up here real quick on this. Gives you basically a managed instance in your environment that you have a lot of control over. Very fast to scale up, scale down. Kubernetes is used for HA with availability groups also to enhance that HA if you so desire or need. Again, business critical, very similar to Enterprise Edition for limitations. Standard Edition, general purpose, are kind of equal there, if you will. You can run PostgreSQL, talk more about that maybe another time, and direct or indirectly connected node. And I just want to kind of real quick hit these couple resources. Jumpstart ArcBox. So if you're saying, I want to play with this stuff, but I don't have an environment to really do this with. If you go to Jumpstart ArcBox, and I have a link on another slide here, but basically it will spin up 7 VMs for you and put it into an environment inside of Azure that you can play with. And from my experience, it cost me about 25 or 30 bucks a day. It takes about half an hour to deploy. So it's very quick to deploy. And it has all the services that we talked about today and more in the Jumpstart ArcBox project. I have some click-through demos. I think that they're still active. And I have a link to another user group recording that excellent stuff. I have some links here for Jumpstart and Jumpstart demos, the Learn module for this, and the John Deere customer story that talks about how they used Arc as well. And that's it for my slides. I ran through this last one's kind of quick though.
No worries, Rick.
Yes.
What a layered, multi-component system this Azure Arc and Arc Data Services are. Thank you very much for this presentation and all these resources, especially the back-end slide deck here where you have all these links. This is amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to learn. I'm still learning a lot.
Yeah.
Every day. So I encourage you to get out there and play with it. And I can stay on for a few minutes if you want me to answer questions, or if there's any questions to answer.
I don't see any right here. Guys, if you have any questions, fire away with Rick. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. And what we'll do is this recording will process. It'll take about maybe, I don't know, 10 or 20 minutes. And then I'll post it up on YouTube. Should be on YouTube within, by 2 o'clock this afternoon.
All right. Sounds great. I enjoyed it, and I hope everybody learned something.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick, very much. And we'll have to have you back to talk about Postgres.
Yeah. And also, we need to do this in person.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, please.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Where'd you get those links, please? The links that you just talk about.
These ones here?
Yeah.
So I will give Tim the deck, and so can you post that as well, Tim?
Yep. I'll paste it up into the this link right here. I'll put it right here. I'll paste it in here. Yeah, you should see it as soon as I get it. You'll see it posted up into our OneDrive.
Thank you, Mr. Rick. Thank you, Tim.
All right.
No
Thank you.
I see Cody asked, when are we going to have in-person meetings again? Like Rick, I don't know. When we don't see anybody wearing masks, that's, I think that's a simple, not a simple answer, but I guess a complicated answer. When this thing all dies down.
All right.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm going to stop recording.